So we're going to do a quick walkthrough of Android Studio to try to point you to some of the major components that are present in the IDE. When you start Android Studio for the first time, you're going to be given this dialog where you can create a new project, open a project that is already on your storage device, or you can get a project from a version control system such as Git or GitHub. For this walkthrough, we're just going to start a new project. And the first thing I'm asked is whether or not I'm building this application for a phone or tablet, Wear OS, which is a watch, Android TV, or automotive, Android Auto. These are the current categories. Future versions of Android Studio may add or remove categories or rename or reorder them. For this course, we're always going to build applications for phone and tablet. The next thing we're asked is to select an activity. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of what an activity is later on, but for now, we can just appreciate that an activity is essentially a window in your application or a screen. For this course, we are always going to use empty activities to start, and we're going to build all the features that we need ourselves. But just taking a quick glance here, you can see that there are quite a few templates that are available to us if we wanted to jumpstart our development and have a few artifacts or features implemented for us automatically that we then just had to go in and modify. But as I said, we're always going to start with empty activity. I'll hit next. I'm asked to give my application a name. Thereafter, there is a package name that's requested that uses the reverse domain notation in order to determine the fully qualified name for all the classes and artifacts that will be in your application, as well as your default application ID. Where do you want to save that project, the language of the project, and the minimum SDK. The minimum SDK essentially is a number that's going to help you determine two things. First, in some ways, it's going to determine the feature set, how many features you will be able to implement in your application. To some degree, you can have a minimum API that is a particular level, but build features that are for a more recent version of the API. But that can add to the complexity of making sure that those features are not invoked if you are running on the minimum. So usually when someone selects the minimum SDK, what they're usually saying is we're going to basically just have all the features stop at that version. The next thing it does is it gives you basically an estimate of how many Android devices currently in the wild can run your application. The lower the API number is, the more people can run it. The higher it is, the fewer people can run it. So that's a trade-off you have to make. Whether you want a lot of people to be able to run your application, which might mean a lower minimum SDK, lower SDK, which would mean more complexity in ensuring that users are able to, more complexity in building features, or you can go to a higher minimum SDK, which can make implementing your features easier to some degree, but it also limits the number of people, generally speaking, that will be able to run and use your application. From there, we'll hit finish, and Android Studio will generate a basic template for me. Now, if you've used any development IDE, you will, of course, recognize a lot of what we're seeing here. On the left, we have a Project Explorer, or again, using sort of a generic name. And on the right, we have a viewer. The Project Explorer will show me my files relating to my project. And anytime, whenever I open a file, I can see it in the viewer along with the contents. In the bottom right, you can actually see that this progress bar tells me that Android Studio is still busy doing something. And it's been my experience that when Android Studio is busy, you don't want to give it more work. So we want to kind of wait here, pay attention to that progress bar, and allow it to basically load everything that it needs for this project. Sometimes this can be very slow, especially if you're loading Android Studio for the first time, and you might have faster load times subsequently. But to be honest, you never really know. Android Studio is very, very finicky. While that's happening, I'll just bring your attention to some of the main things. So The top right here, I have a toolbar that has some features that we're going to talk about in a moment. Below, for me, it's the bottom left. I have some tabs here that grant me access to certain windows that will allow me to either get information about my project or about the versioning system that's implemented or messages that my application or a virtual device might print. And we'll get to all of those in a moment as soon as the Project Explorer loads and we can actually dive into our project features. So here we are. On the left, the project, my current project is displayed, and here you can see there are essentially two top level items, app and Gradle scripts. Under app, we have three top level folders, manifests, which is what will store the Android manifest file. You can think of this as basically a description of the high level components and some of the features or requirements of my application. We have the Java folder, which will contain three packages. The first, which is the package name, the default package name, will have all of my, certainly the default activity that was created for me, as well as this is the place where I would add any new classes, activities, anything else. This is where they show up. These two packages are for testing framework, UI tests, and unit tests. And under RES, which stands for resources, we have a list of essentially non-code artifacts. So anything that we use in our application that is not code, not Kotlin, is usually categorized as a resource. And we have different types of resources here, things like drawables. This is a drawable is anything that can be drawn. So you may think of it as an image, although it can go beyond that. Layout files, we'll learn more about these later on. Bitmap is another type of image, specifically though used for app icons. Values can store different things, strings, themes, colors, numbers, quite a few different resource types. And XML, again, is it's sort of a catch-all folder for different types of resources that our application may use for different things. So this is where we tend to spend most of our time creating and modifying files. Under Gradle scripts, you will find a set of files that are related more to your project and how your project will be converted into an actual Android application when you build it. So Gradle is the build system that Android Studio uses. And all we need to really know about a build system is that it's the way or the system that takes a project, however it's structured on storage, however Android Studio lays out its documents, and turns it into something else. It performs all the general actions that you need to automate to turn one thing into something else. So whether that's building your application or running certain tests or generating certain code or whatever else, it's the build system that Android Studio uses. It's its own programming language, in effect. The build system that allows those things to happen. So we don't usually do too much here, but I will bring your attention to one specific build.gradle file, which, depending on the version of Android you're using, the build.gradle for the specific app module is where you would do things like add your dependencies. These might be libraries or features that you want to add or be able to utilize in your application, but they're third party or they're not built into the SDK. You would add them here. So this is one of the places where we tend to show up and mess around. You may want to do things like change the minimum SDK or change the application ID or the compile SDK, so you can modify certain configuration settings in the build.gradle file. Usually the app module, the top level file, we usually don't have any reason to come here and modify anything. And if you do, you'll be given an instruction to do it, whether by some sort of documentation or a tool will tell you what to do. So you don't have to worry about it too much. So again, this is the project. On the right, we have the viewer. So when you open a file, we can see it. This is my default activity. This is the screen that'll show up if I ever run the app. And this particular activity is using a layout file. This layout file is what gives the activity a user interface. And we'll talk about how those two things come together later on. But these two files act in tandem to give us our main screen. At the bottom, we have, as I mentioned, some tabs to pop up different windows. So if I enable version control in my application, like I want to be able to integrate this with my GitHub account. So whenever I have a project, I want to just be able to push it directly to GitHub. I can do that here. And if I enable VCS, like share project on GitHub, then I'll be able to get GitHub information or Git related information here. To do is a window that will scan your project for any to-do messages and show them here, so you can actually jump to a file where and the line where a to-do message was, so you can leave a note to yourself to come back and do something or finish something, and then when you are ready to do that, you just hop over here and you can do that work. Problems is basically feedback about your issues that you're in your project. Terminal, I'm on a Linux, well, I'm actually on a Windows machine, so this is a PowerShell. It's basically a command line. If I was on Linux, I'd have a Linux terminal. On Mac, I'd have something Mac specific. I'm not going to go through all of these. They'll take us a minute, but App Inspector inspection allows me to get debug information. Logcat is something we will use a lot. The Logcat, this window will do two things. It'll give me certain messages or stack traces, crash reports if there's a problem in my app. But it's also where we will get information that we print for ourselves. So as a way to debug or keep track of things, we may put little debug messages in our program that we want to be able to see, or log messages that we want to be able to see as our code executes to check on certain things. And when we do that, as the app executes, it's the Logcat window that will show us those messages, and it will allow us to do things like search for a certain message and filter, things like that. We have the build and we have the profiler. Like I said, we're not going to go into detail. We're not going to use any of these. Really, we're going to pretty much stick to Logcat, maybe terminal, maybe version control, depending on what we're doing. At the top, we'll see that we have this toolbar. This is to select a configuration. Unless you've added or changed a configuration, you shouldn't need to really do anything here. Here's where we select the Android virtual device or the real device that we want to use to run our app. So we'll come back to this in a moment. When you've built an application and you want to execute it, you much like with other IDEs, there's a run button. So this allows you to run your app. Next to it, there's another one that allows you to run the app, but instead of restarting the whole app, you just rerun the portion of the app where you made some changes. So that can allow your app to run faster rather than having to kill the entire app and compile it and run it again. We have here a debug feature. So when you're writing Android applications, you can put breakpoints in your code, and instead of running it with the run app option, you run it with debug. And what will happen is whenever your application is executing, if it hits a breakpoint, it will actually pause execution at that point and give you a report on the current state of your application. So it will tell you all the objects that exist, the variables that are there, and the values that they're storing. And that can be an invaluable tool in debugging your application to see if you're having issues, if you're not able to pass data from one place to another. This will allow you to inspect it to see exactly what's happening at each step of the way, and then you can essentially use that to help figure out what's going wrong with your code. This is for coverage. I want to jump over to these two features we want to talk about: the device manager and the SDK manager. Looking at the SDK manager first, this is a feature that allows us to download different versions of Android that we want to use to run or execute, or essentially to get a new SDK if we want to build for a new version of Android. So here you can see every time a new version of Android is released, it's available here and we can just select it to download. There are other tools that we can get from the SDK manager as well. So here on the SDK tools, we'll see that there are different features, usually third party or essentially tools that you can use for Android development that are not a part of the SDK by default. The next thing I want to bring your attention to is the device manager. So the device manager is what allows you to manage whether virtual or real Android devices that will allow you to run your application. So when you're doing Android development and you want to test your app, you have the ability to connect a real Android device to your development machine. And if I did that, it would show up in this list after enabling developer mode. But you also have the ability to use a virtual device. That is a device that is run entirely in software. So here I have a virtual device and I could actually run that virtual device and it will launch whether in a new window or as a integrated window in the IDE. I can go to my options and decide on which one I want. So this is a virtual device and I can actually install software and use this not as a real phone, but it pretty much has all the necessary features to test most things. There comes a point where if you're building a sufficiently advanced Android application, you do need to test it on a physical, real device. But for most of your initial testing, this will work just fine. Now, to create a virtual device from the device manager, I just hit on create device. I select the type of device I want to create, a phone, a tablet, Wear OS, etc. I can create a new hardware profile or import one, but it's easier to just select one from the current list. Some of these are named devices, known devices that were made by Google, and others are just generic device descriptions. Again, it depends on what you're trying to test. That can lead you to decide on which type of virtual device you would create. Afterwards, you select the version of Android you want to have installed on that device. You can either select one that you've already downloaded or download another version of Android. Give that device a name, specify how the device should start in portrait or landscape, and you can also do things like map your device keyboard, your laptop or computer keyboard, to the virtual device keyboard so that when you type on your keyboard, it's as if you're typing on the phone. Similarly, you can link your camera, you can modify memory, you can do a lot of different things to get the device exactly the way you want it to do the types of tests that you want. Once you've done that, you hit finish and it will generate a device and you'll have another device in the list. Now, you don't actually have to run your device from the device manager. In fact, the device will automatically be executed if it's not running, or automatically have an application loaded if you start to run an application that you're working on. So when I hit run app here, it actually will launch my app on this running device. And if there was no device running, it would launch a virtual device that I had previously created. If you had not created a virtual device, then it would ask you to create one, or at least let you know that there are none created. So here my application is building. It's taking quite a while because this is the very first time I'm running it. We would hope it would run a little faster the next time. And once this is done, we will actually see the app running on the virtual device. And there you have it, a basic app running on a device. So Android Studio has quite a few more features. Most of them we'll discover as we go through. We'll find more interesting and specialized features. But by and large, what we've touched on here are the main things that we'll be using most often as we build and work on Android applications.